If you went back to Bath, England on the 11th of May 973, you might be lucky enough to see the second coronation not only of King Edgar, but the coronation of England's first crowned queen consort. This was Aelfthryth, but as the years went on, history would remember her as a seducer, a regent in her son's stead, and most chilling of all, as a possible murderer. Aelfthryth is also known as Elfrida, and so in regard to your narrator being able to pronounce her name without embarrassment, that is the name we will use throughout this video. Not much is known of Elfrida's early life, but it is known that her father was Ordgar, ealdorman of a place called Dumnonia, most likely Devon and Cornwall. Her mother's name is lost to history, but she was descended from royalty, most likely that of Wessex. However, Elfrida's origins are still shadowy, as when she was born, and later married, her father was still merely a thane, with no official position at the king's court. He must have been a person of some importance regardless, perhaps holding great wealth, for the marriages his daughter would later make. It's thought she was born in the 940s, and Elfrida would therefore have only been a very young teenager when she entered her first marriage in around 956 to Ethelwold, ealdorman of East Anglia. He was the son of Ethelstan the Half-King, and as such was part of a powerful family. Ethelstan was ealdorman of Mercia and ruled over a territory the size of Normandy. This would one day be passed on to his son Ethelwold, along with the enormous family wealth. This shows that Elfrida must have been an equal in order to become his wife. William of Malmesbury left a colourful tale about how the pair met, although its reliability is unknown. Apparently, King Edgar, recently separated from his second wife Wulfthryth, who had decided to become a nun, was looking for a new wife. He had heard of the legendary beauty of the daughter of the ealdorman Ordgar, and he sent Ethelwold to take a look and determine if she really was as beautiful as everyone said. The story goes, Ethelwold visited Elfrida and did indeed find her the most stunning woman he had ever laid eyes on, so he decided there and then to lie to the king and say she was quite ugly and there was no point in marrying her, before proceeding to marry Elfrida himself. They married in 956 and would remain so until Ethelwold's death in about 964. Eventually, King Edgar found out about the marriage and decided to visit the couple himself. Ethelwold panicked and demanded Elfrida dress herself as badly as possible, not do her hair, cover her face, and generally appear as unattractive as possible. Elfrida was quite put out by this and did the opposite, wearing her finest jewels and clothing and basically showing herself off to the king. When Edgar arrived, he fell instantly in love with her and killed Ethelwold during a hunt in order to marry Elfrida for himself. While this is a dramatic story, it's not likely to be true. Most marriages around this time were political in nature, and while that's not to say royalty and nobility wouldn't fall in love, it certainly wasn't the first consideration. It's more likely that Ethelwold died, leaving Elfrida a widow and a suitably noble prospect for a king looking for a new wife, whose heirs would have legitimacy. Edgar's son from his first relationship, Edward, was of doubtful parentage, and the only known child of his marriage to Wulfthryth was Edith, a daughter. Elfrida had ties to the earldom of Devon and Cornwall, the royal family of Wessex, and ties to Mercia after her first marriage. Any sons they would have together would be firmly seen as legitimate inheritors of the throne of England. King Edgar and Elfrida were married in around 964. Just over a year later, in 966, Elfrida gave birth to their first son, Edmund. In that same year at Winchester, in a charter by King Edgar, the young Edmund is listed as Clito Legitimus, the legitimate Aethelin. He even appears in the list of witnesses despite being a baby, and comes before his half-brother Edward. This was part of a shifting attitude to how a future king came to the throne. While in the past the Witan, or King's Council, could choose someone not the son of the previous king if they doubted their abilities, by the 10th century the royal family was making attempts to keep the throne within their own bloodline. Elfrida then cemented this by giving birth to a second son in 968, Aethelred. Sadly, their first son, Edmund, died in 970 at just 3 or 4 years old, leaving only one legitimate son for the throne. Aethelred is likely, as was the custom at the time in royal Anglo-Saxon families, to have spent much time with his mother. While a formal education would probably begin when Aethelred was about 7 or 8 years old, mothers were in charge of introducing their children to simple reading and writing, and probably also encouraging their religious education. A tutor would most likely also be in a position within the church, as most scholars were also monks or nuns. Aethelred would also have been expected, at the same time his formal education with a tutor began, to learn the more warlike aspects of being a king. This would have meant learning to defend with a shield, using a short sword, and using a bow. Very little is recorded of King Edgar's reign, but a few events are known that show he was a good and diligent, if not overachieving, king. He strongly supported the English Benedictine reform, a religious and intellectual movement that occurred during his reign within the church. It allowed a blossoming of culture, literature and art. Edgar also introduced a standardised coinage in 970 to replace the previous system, which was decentralised and therefore made it difficult to maintain a tax system across the whole country. He also attempted to bring in new legislation that would help enforce the law system in place. And yet Edgar still seems to have felt the need to secure his place with a second coronation. His first was probably in 959 when he succeeded to the throne of England, but he then planned a second coronation on the 11th of May 973 in the Roman town of Bath. Before gaining the throne, he had been king of the Mercians only, and his brother Eadwig had been known as king of the English, but only ruling over Wessex and the rest of England. So it is possible, after several years holding the kingdom in a stable position, that Edgar wanted to reinforce his claim over all of England. But his coronation was significant for another reason. It was also the coronation of his queen consort Elfrida, an unprecedented event in Anglo-Saxon history. At this point, she had responsibility for nunneries across England, an important part of political involvement for royal women. The lands she brought with her from her dowry in Rutland and Suffolk were an important part of her influence over the rule in the West. And she also had made an alliance with Ethelwald, Bishop of Winchester, who was close to the royal family and virtually a court chaplain, making her linked to the monastic reforms of the time. All these pieces of evidence suggest Edgar regarded his wife not merely as a producer of legitimate sons, but also as an integral part of his power and hold over his kingdom. She would not have been an equal, but Elfrida was certainly his right-hand person. Elfrida was only crowned as a queen consort, not a queen in her own right. However, her coronation signalled her importance, placing her only beneath the king, and certainly at the highest rank for a woman in the land. It also emphasised her important role as protector of religion and the nunneries. Elfrida would also go on to play a large role in the legal runnings of the court as a forespecca, or advocate. In at least 7 legal cases, Elfrida played a part in mediating between individuals who came to argue their cause and the crown itself. The crown being involved in disputes like these would continue for many centuries, in a role seen as a protector of the realm. Her presence was especially helpful for women coming to argue their case, and was an example of the legal and political power that Elfrida was able to hold in her own right. The stability was not to last, however. In 975, King Edgar died, leaving 2 sons. His son Aethelred, with his wife Elfrida, was legitimate, but still only 7 years old. By contrast, his eldest son Edward was probably at the age of majority, at the time 14 years old, but was possibly not legitimate. He was also known for having violent outbursts, offending many important religious and political members of the court. There were supporters for both sons, but the supporters of Edward, wary perhaps of having a mere child on the throne, were more persuasive in their arguments, and he was crowned as King of England before the end of 975. Elfrida, who obviously had supported the unsuccessful claim of her own son Aethelred, was now Queen Dowager. She would have continued to enjoy a prominent position at court, most likely as an advisor, and would have retained the properties that were held in her name. This was confirmed by Edward himself as a gift towards his stepmother. However, once Edward was married, she would have been less important at court as the new royal wife became the queen consort, and it's possible she would have done what many former queens did and retreated to a nunnery. There is no evidence that Elfrida was bothered by this, however. She established herself at Corfe, where there was a royal residence, along with her son Aethelred. There is little evidence of how stable the country was in Edward's short reign, but it seems to have started unravelling with his father's death. Edgar had been a firm, perhaps overbearing ruler, and had held steady his support for ecclesiastical reform even when it disrupted land rights and traditional networks of religious patronage. Without a strong leader, this soon began to collapse, with noble families and religious leaders on both sides scrambling over lands. Nobles attempted to recover properties that had been gifted to monasteries under Edgar's rule, and monasteries attempted to take new lands for themselves. A chronicler of contemporary events, Breatfirth of Ramsey, wrote that the country bordered on civil war. The south and west mainly leaned towards Edward, the north and east for Aethelred. Political turmoil, therefore, seems to have been the hallmark of Edward's short reign. Still a young boy himself, even with his supporters around him, he could not hope to hold the kingdom together with such long-awaited grievances coming out. But importantly, there is no evidence that this tension developed in the royal family itself. Edward seems to have had a good relationship with his stepmother Elfrida, as well as with his half-brother Aethelred. However, on the 18th of March 978, Edward would be murdered at Corfe, a property owned by Elfrida, and then a Saxon hall rather than a stone castle. Throughout history, the story surrounding this has posited Elfrida as the wicked stepmother killing her stepson to secure England's throne for her own son. Edward was informally visiting Elfrida and Aethelred at Corfe and arrived in the evening with a small retinue of attendants. He was then dragged from his horse by Elfrida's attendants and murdered quickly. His body was unceremoniously buried nearby at Wareham. However, the earliest sources for this event make no mention that Elfrida or Aethelred were involved. Aethelred certainly would have been too young to take any part in political machinations, and Elfrida seems to have little complaint herself. Importantly, we also know that neither Elfrida or Aethelred were blamed for the crime or punished, suggesting they had no knowledge of the event. Her name first appears more than a century later, connecting her to the crime, but by this point, a cult had grown up around Edward, now known as the Martyr, and as part of this, he became a saint. Literature grew up around this, pointing the finger of blame at Elfrida, who was the main person to gain from his death other than her son, and later outright accusing her of the murder. Although there is no direct evidence placing her as the murderer, the earliest sources still criticise her for allowing the criminals to escape justice. Regicide was one of the worst crimes possible, as a king was seen as God's representative on earth, and Elfrida, who was the holder of local jurisdiction, should have brought them to justice. But the truth is, much of the crime remains in shadow. We do not know what efforts were really made to bring the murderers to justice, or if Elfrida was involved in any way, merely with knowledge or more with the actual planning. The facts were that Edward's death made things easier for the Benedictine reformers, certainly, but only that much. It is possible that the planning of the murder was made without Elfrida's knowledge, and it's equally possible that she knew something about it, and possibly may even have taken part in planning it. It is also possible that the murder was carried out by men who had much to gain by Edward's death, and conducted the murder on their own initiative. But there is no evidence in either case, and in Elfrida's time, she was certainly not seen as to blame personally. Whoever was to blame for Edward's murder, his natural successor was his younger half-brother Aethelred. Aethelred was only about 10 years old at this point, and so was unable to rule without a regent, which naturally was his mother Elfrida. She would help rule until he came of age in around 982 or a little later. This can only have served to fuel later rumours of her involvement. However, Aethelred was careful during his reign to establish himself at the centre of his brother's religious cult. Edward's remains were recovered and reinterred at Shaftesbury Abbey, where he was established as a saint. A grant made by Aethelred in favour of Shaftesbury Abbey in 1001, several years into his reign, states the gift is being made to God and to his saint, my brother Edward, whom, drenched with his own blood, the Lord has seen fit to magnify in our time through many miracles. And a later law code of Aethelred's ensured that the 18th of March was kept as a feast day for St. Edward. This was undoubtedly both to help ease the disputes over Edward's reign and death, as well as to promote Aethelred's own kingship. Despite the difficulties of his half-brother's death and the suspicion around it, Beatfirth of Ramsey wrote that the people rejoiced at Aethelred's crowning. He was described as a handsome young youth with a noble bearing, and there seems to have been no hint of the later difficulties within his reign or with his later advisors. During Aethelred's early reign, Elfrida and her council ruled efficiently and with as much firmness as Edgar had done. Perhaps people were simply grateful for the stability of an unquestioned reign. Charters signed during this time by Elfrida list her as Aelfthryth Regina, something she hadn't done during Edward's reign. She probably acted as regent alongside Bishop Ethelwold, who was still an ally of hers. Little is known about how involved she was in decisions made during this time, but it is known that as Ethelred came of age, she was pushed further to one side. By 983, Ethelred was beginning to assert his own authority, and Elfrida's name in charters changes at this point to Aelfthryth, Mother of the King. At the beginning of Ethelred's reign, Bishop Ethelwold was prominent as an advisor, but after his death in 984, Ethelred immediately favoured younger courtiers as his council, and he created new policies which reduced the church's lands and favour, something he later regretted. Abingdon Abbey was reduced almost to servitude, encouraged by two men whispering in the young king's ear, Wulfgar, Bishop of Ramsbury, and a certain Ealdorman Elfric. They both had reasons for this, whether furthering careers or purchasing land. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle points out how in 986 the king laid waste to the diocese of Rochester. Just a few years later in 993, he stated in a charter that Bishop Ethelwald's death had deprived the country of one whose industry and pastoral care administered not only to my interest, but also to that of all inhabitants of the country. This suggests that Elfrida and the other advisors around young Aethelred, especially Bishop Ethelwald, had not then been acting in anything but the country's best interests. Nevertheless, Elfrida, at this point, disappears from charters. At some point in the mid-980s, Aethelred also married his first wife, Aelfthryth. She was eclipsed by the Queen Mother, and it would seem Elfrida took over the upbringing of her young grandchildren. Elfrida once again took a prominent position at court, enjoying a renewed status as the Dowager Queen and rearer of the throne's future heirs. It doesn't seem Aelfthryth got much of a say in the matter. She would never be anointed queen as Elfrida had, and never signed any charters. In later years, Ethelred's eldest son, Ethelstan Aetheling, gave prayer for the soul of his grandmother in his words written in his will of 1014, "Who brought me up." Elfrida's reputation had been damaged by the death of her stepson Edward, but she recovered it somewhat with her new position, fostering her young grandchildren at court, and through the founding of 2 new monastic institutions. The Chronicle of Melrose shows that Elfrida founded the first of these, Amesbury Abbey, in around 979. This was a Benedictine abbey for nuns, and was likely built upon the site of an earlier abbey. The second of these was Wherwell Abbey in Hampshire, which also became a Benedictine nunnery, founded in around late 986. Elfrida now would have been in her late 40s, and by her early 50s seems to have retreated into the nunnery she founded, Wherwell Abbey. Her granddaughter, listed as a daughter of King Ethelred but herself unnamed, would later be abbess there. On the 17th of November, in either 1000 or 1001, Elfrida died at the abbey she had founded. Her carelessness or deliberate non-attempts to bring to justice the killers of her stepson would haunt her memory. In later centuries, Elfrida would be pointed to as part of the plot to kill Edward, later outright blamed implicitly, and some would even go so far as to accuse her of witchcraft and murdering others. Many medieval histories would place her as the wicked stepmother and an example of a bad queen, mad with gaining power for herself. But the few sources from the time in which Elfrida lived don't actually show this. It is impossible to say with certainty who actually murdered Edward, and just as difficult to say Elfrida had no knowledge at all of the event. But on the flip side, neither is there proof she was involved, and it seems difficult to believe a court and country who truly thought she was a murderess would have accepted her position as her son's regent, and yet they did so happily by all accounts. From the little known of Elfrida, she appears to be an example of the heights an Anglo-Saxon woman could reach. In an era when women were not deemed to be able to do an equal job to a man in many respects, Elfrida was the first crowned queen consort, wielded political power in her own right, acted as a legal advocate, and even held the country together as regent in a brief period of peace and stability for England. She also seems to have taken her role as protector of the nunneries seriously, not only founding abbeys, but also helping the Benedictine reform her husband advocated, and retiring herself into a religious life. Elfrida is a difficult queen to pin down. While we can never completely clear her of the murder of Edward, we can say that she surpassed the role expected of her as a royal wife, and there are clear indicators that people in her own time did not necessarily consider her to be a murderer either. Elfrida was certainly an impressive and clever woman who was able to turn things to her advantage. She would leave a legacy as Aelfthryth, the wicked stepmother, but it's clear she was much more than that. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.